The Atlantic was gray that morning, the kind of gray that made the ocean look endless and heavy, as if the entire sky had fallen into the water. The transport ship moved steadily through the mist, its engines humming deep beneath the steel decks. To the sailors, it was simply another voyage. But for the men standing behind the guarded railings, it was something entirely different. They were German generals, captured officers of a defeated army, men who only months earlier had commanded divisions across Europe. Now they were prisoners of war being transported across the ocean to a country many of them had never seen. America. For years they had heard about it through propaganda broadcasts and political speeches. They had been told it was a weak society, a chaotic democracy, a nation softened by luxury and comfort. Some believed those claims. Others pretended to. But as the ship cut through the Atlantic fog, even the most confident among them began to feel a quiet uncertainty. General Friedrich Adler stood near the railing, his gloved hands resting against the cold metal. At 54, he had spent nearly his entire adult life in the military. He had studied strategy in Berlin, commanded artillery during the early campaigns of the war, and later directed logistics for entire armored units. Order and discipline had always defined his world. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. Exile across an ocean. Behind him, several other officers murmured quietly in German. Rumors had spread throughout the ship during the long voyage. Some believed America was collapsing under the weight of war. Others believed the country was full of factories and wealth, but lacked the discipline to sustain real power. A colonel named Reinhardt spoke confidently one evening during the voyage. "America builds machines," he said, "but machines are not civilization." Several officers nodded. Yet none of them truly knew what awaited them. For most Germans during the war, America had been an abstraction, a distant industrial giant somewhere beyond the ocean. Now they were sailing directly toward it. Days later, shortly after sunrise, a sailor's voice echoed across the deck. "Land ahead." The prisoners were ordered to assemble along the railings. Fog rolled slowly across the water. At first, there was nothing but shapes in the distance. Then gradually, the shapes began to sharpen. A shoreline appeared. But what stunned the officers was not simply the land. It was the scale of what rose beyond it. The harbor seemed alive with motion. Ships of every size moved across the water. Cargo vessels, passenger ferries, tugboats guiding massive tankers through narrow channels. Towering cranes lined the docks like enormous metal skeletons, lifting containers and machinery into the air. Smoke drifted upward from dozens of industrial chimneys. Rail lines crisscrossed the waterfront, and beyond it all rose the skyline. Rows of skyscrapers stretching high above the harbor. Glass windows reflecting the morning sun. For a moment, no one spoke. Several of the generals had expected a powerful country. But this was something else. This was movement on a scale they had never imagined. One officer muttered quietly, "It looks untouched." Another whispered back, "Because it is." The war had devastated Europe. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Factories destroyed. Railroads shattered. But here, across the ocean, the machinery of a massive nation continued to function without interruption. The ship slowly approached the harbor. As it passed the outer channel, the prisoners noticed something else. The water traffic did not slow down for them. Freight ships continued unloading cargo. Dock workers shouted instructions. Rail cars rattled across bridges. The entire harbor functioned like a giant engine. And the arrival of captured enemy generals barely seemed to interrupt its rhythm. That realization unsettled them more than hostility would have. Soon the ship moved past a tall green statue rising from a small island. Many of the officers recognized it immediately. The Statue of Liberty. They had seen it in photographs before the war. Yet standing there in person, it seemed strangely calm. Not a symbol of triumph. Simply a monument watching over the harbor. One officer laughed quietly. So the statue survived the war as well. But the laugh carried uncertainty. The vessel finally docked. Guards escorted the prisoners down a narrow gangway. Several journalists stood nearby taking photographs. American soldiers supervised the transfer with quiet efficiency. No shouting. No humiliation. The general were simply directed toward a line of waiting trucks. General Adler noticed something peculiar. No one seemed particularly interested in them. Workers continued loading cargo only a few meters away. A group of longshoremen pushed crates across the dock while discussing something among themselves. None of them stopped to stare. None of them shouted insults. To the Americans, the arrival of enemy officers appeared to be just another logistical task. The trucks soon carried the prisoners away from the harbor and into the city. For many of the generals, the journey through the streets of New York was the first real shock. They expected damage from war. They expected shortages. But instead they saw crowded streets filled with movement. Streetcars sliding along rails. Delivery trucks unloading goods outside shops. Restaurants opening for the morning. People hurrying to work. Everything looked ordinary. That was the most surprising part. It was normal. Shop windows displayed radios, shoes, cameras, and clothing. Children walked to school carrying books. A group of construction workers stood on scaffolding, repairing a building facade. The city moved with the confidence of a place untouched by destruction. General Adler leaned slightly forward in his seat. He watched a bakery worker placing fresh loaves into a storefront display. The smell drifted briefly through the open air. Bread. It had been a long time since he had smelled bread baked in such quantity. In Germany, during the final months of the war, food had become scarce. Even officers had faced rationing. But here the bakery window held dozens of loaves stacked neatly in rows. The trucks continued north through the city until they reached a railway station. There the prisoners were transferred into passenger rail cars. The train waiting for them was not a military transport. It was a standard American passenger train. Inside were padded seats and large windows. Some of the officers exchanged surprised glances. A guard passed through the aisle carrying a metal container. He handed each prisoner a paper cup of coffee. Another soldier distributed sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. The officers accepted them cautiously. No one had expected such treatment. The train began moving south through the countryside. Gradually, the urban landscape gave way to open fields. Farmhouses appeared among rolling farmland. Tractors moved slowly across large plots of cultivated land. Rows of crops stretched across the fields in perfect alignment. Everything looked organized, but not rigid. There were no patrols watching the farms. No armed overseers. Just ordinary farmers working their land. The officers watched quietly through the windows. Colonel Reinhardt eventually spoke. "I thought democracy meant disorder." General Adler replied calmly. "Perhaps we misunderstood the definition." Hours later, the train slowed near a wooded area along a river. Their destination was a prisoner of war camp operated by the United States Army. The camp was surrounded by fences and guard towers, but the buildings themselves looked surprisingly simple. Low wooden barracks, administrative offices, storage buildings. Inside the camp, the prisoners were assigned living quarters. Each barracks contained clean bunks, desks, and heating stoves. Meals were served 3 times a day. The food was basic but plentiful. Bread, vegetables, meat several times each week. American regulations required POWs to receive treatment consistent with the Geneva Convention. For the German generals, however, the greatest surprise was not the food or the housing. It was the behavior of the guards. The American soldiers did not treat them with hostility. Instead, they maintained a calm, professional distance. Orders were given politely. Discipline was enforced when necessary. But there was little of the harshness the prisoners had expected. One evening during the first week, an American officer visited the barracks to introduce himself. His name was Captain Robert Mason. He explained the rules of the camp clearly and without threats. "You will be treated fairly," he said, "as long as the regulations are respected." The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. But after he left, several of the generals remained silent for a long time. The tone of the conversation had felt strange. It was not the language of domination. It was the language of administration. Life inside the camp soon settled into a routine. Mornings began with breakfast and roll call. Afterward, many of the prisoners participated in organized activities. Some attended lectures arranged by camp officials. Others worked on translations or wrote letters home. Books were available in several languages. Newspapers were delivered regularly. General Adler spent much of his time walking along the inner fence of the camp. From there, he could see beyond the perimeter. Fields stretched toward distant hills. Freight trains occasionally passed along a nearby rail line. Each train carried dozens of loaded cars. Coal, steel, agricultural goods. The constant movement of industry reminded him of something. Power, not military power alone, but economic power. A few weeks after arriving, several of the generals were invited to participate in discussions with American intelligence officers. These conversations were not interrogations in the traditional sense. Instead, they resembled professional debates about military strategy. The Americans asked detailed questions about supply systems, transportation networks, and battlefield logistics. One afternoon, Captain Mason placed a map of Europe across a large table. He asked General Adler to explain how German supply routes had functioned during the early stages of the war. Adler hesitated. Then he began outlining the system. Rail lines, fuel depots, truck convoys. As he spoke, the American officers listened carefully. Occasionally, they asked technical questions. But there was no mockery, no triumph, only analysis. When the session ended, one of the American officers shook Adler's hand. "Your system was efficient," he said, "but it depended on perfect conditions." Adler nodded slowly. "And your system?" he asked. The officer smiled. "Ours depends on redundancy." That single word stayed with Adler long after the meeting. Redundancy. Multiple supply routes. Backup systems. Mass production. It was the logic of a nation designed to endure disruption. Weeks passed. Winter arrived. Snow covered the fields around the camp. Inside the barracks, the prisoners gathered in the evenings to discuss what they had seen. Some still insisted America was merely lucky. But others had begun to reach a different conclusion. The strength of the country did not come from strict control. It came from coordination between millions of individuals working toward shared goals. Factories produced enormous quantities of equipment. Railroads carried goods across thousands of miles. Farmers supplied food, not only for their own nation but for allies across the ocean. All of it functioned without a centralized authoritarian command. One night General Adler wrote a note in his journal. The most unexpected discovery here is confidence. The people behave as if their future is secure. Months later, a small group of prisoners was allowed to visit a nearby town under military supervision. The trip was intended to demonstrate aspects of American civilian life. The generals entered the town cautiously. They expected tension from local residents. Instead, they found something entirely different. Ordinary life continued around them. People walked along the sidewalks carrying groceries. Cars moved through intersections. A movie theater displayed posters for the latest films. Several townspeople glanced at the visiting officers with curiosity, but most simply continued with their daily routines. One shop owner even nodded politely as the group passed. The moment felt surreal. Here were former enemies walking through an American town. And yet there was no anger, no fear, just quiet normalcy. Before returning to the camp, the group stopped near a grain processing facility. Inside the building, enormous conveyor belts carried corn upward into tall storage silos. An engineer explained how the facility processed thousands of tons of grain each month. General Adler watched the machinery carefully. Every belt moved with precise timing. Every worker understood his role. The entire system functioned smoothly, without shouting, without coercion. Later that evening, Adler wrote another note in his journal. We studied their weapons during the war, but we never studied the society that produced them. By the summer of 1946, the war had ended completely. Repatriation plans began circulating among the prisoners. Soon they would return to Germany. But the Germany waiting for them was very different from the one they had left. Cities destroyed, infrastructure shattered, a nation forced to rebuild. On the final day before departure, the prisoners gathered near the camp gate. Transport trucks waited to carry them toward the port. General Adler looked back across the camp one last time. The barracks, the guard towers, the quiet fields beyond the fence. Strangely, the place no longer felt like a prison. It had become something else. A classroom. The convoy began moving down the road. As the trucks disappeared into the distance, Adler considered the long journey ahead. For years he had believed strength came from discipline imposed from above. But his time in America had shown him another possibility. Strength could also come from trust, from institutions built to serve citizens rather than command them. The realization did not erase the past, but it changed how he understood the future. Years later, when historians asked former prisoners about their time in American camps, many described a similar experience. They had arrived expecting humiliation. Instead, they encountered a society functioning with quiet confidence. Factories, farms, railroads, schools, all operating within a system that balanced freedom with responsibility. For some of those former officers, the experience influenced their role in rebuilding post-war Germany. They began to see democracy not as weakness, but as a structure capable of generating stability and power. For General Friedrich Adler, the most powerful memory remained simple. Not a speech, not a political argument, but the steady sound of freight trains passing the camp at night. Each train carrying goods across a continent, each whistle echoing through the darkness. To him it sounded like something entirely new. Not the noise of war, but the quiet rhythm of a nation building its future.